Well, good evening. I'm Jed Atkins, the Dean and Director of the School of Civic Life and Leadership here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. At Skill, we seek to educate citizens who have the courage and the capacity to be leaders who speak across differences, making good on the freedoms that our Constitution gives us. One way we do this is through programming that promotes dialogue on matters of public importance. In tonight's discussion on the relationship between the countries with the two largest economies in the world is very important. So I'm especially excited to welcome you to tonight's Abby Speakers Series event, The Future of U.S.-China Relations. The Abby Speakers Series is hosted by UNC's Program for Public Discourse, which seeks to build our students' capacities for debate and deliberation and to foster a culture of constructive dialogue about issues of national importance at UNC and beyond. 4 times each year, the Abby Speakers Series brings together experts from different fields and disciplines to showcase productive dialogue on timely issues across a range of perspectives. On behalf of the university, I thank the Abby family for helping us bring such important programming to campus. I also want to thank the Curriculum in Peace, War, and Defense for co-sponsoring tonight's event. Tonight's panel features 3 distinguished foreign policy experts who will discuss the increasingly fraught relationship between the United States and China. Collectively, they bring decades of high-level experience across both the Democratic and Republican presidential administrations. They share their insights on China's policy, how those policies affect American interests, and how the United States should respond. As always, our goal at the School of Civic Life and Leadership is to demonstrate and cultivate civil discourse. So we welcome their different perspectives. I urge you to listen to each one as they all bring wisdom and insight. They are Admiral Dennis Blair. He is the inaugural Knott Professor, visiting scholar, and Professor of the Practice here at Carolina. Prior to retiring from the Navy after a 34-year career, Admiral Blair led the U.S. Pacific Command. He also served as Director of National Intelligence under President Barack Obama. Matt Turpin is visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. He served as the U.S. National Security Council's director for China and the senior advisor to China on the Secretary of Commerce under President Donald Trump. And before that, he served more than 22 years in the U.S. Army in combat units. And considering that we just celebrated Veterans Day, I would also like to thank Dennis and Matt for their service to our country. Thank you. Susan Shirk is a research professor at UNC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. During the administration of President Bill Clinton, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs, overseeing policy, U.S. policy on China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Mongolia. Lastly, our moderator, Mike Morgan, specializes in modern, international, and global history. He's an associate professor of history here at Carolina, and also an adjunct professor in Skill, and he teaches courses on international history, the Cold War, and human rights. I want to remind the audience that those views expressed by panelists do not necessarily reflect those of the university or the sponsoring programs. And now, I'm going to end and turn things over to our capable panelist and moderator, Mike Morgan.
Thanks, Jed. Ladies and gentlemen, it's such a pleasure to be here with you tonight and an honor to have 3 very distinguished national security experts with us to talk about the future of U.S.-China relations. Before we jump into the discussion, I just want to offer a brief preview of how the event is going to unfold. We're going to start with about an hour of discussion among the speakers on the stage until about 6:30 p.m. And at that point, we'll open the floor to questions from the audience, and we'll have about 30 minutes for Q&A. So please, as you listen to the initial discussion, consider what questions you might like to pose to our panelists. Let's jump right in. It's hard to read a newspaper today without reading stories about rising tensions between the United States and China. But of course, it's worth remembering that relations between these two countries go back quite a long time, and the bilateral relationship has seen quite a lot of ups and downs over the years. So I'd like to start by asking you for a brief historical snapshot in the relationship. What are the key moments in the history of US-China relations that we should think about? And to put it really simply, how did we get here? Professor Shirk, could we start with you?
Well, thanks. Thank you very much for the question, and thanks for inviting all of us here to discuss US-China relations. This is a kind of critical moment in US-China relations. There's, I think, a lot of new debate questions being asked. I think President Trump is kind of opening up the possibility of a very rational discussion of the costs and benefits of different approaches to managing the relationship. So I think it's a very timely topic. So I'm an old China hand, and as you point out, there have been a lot of changes inside China and in Sino-US relations over the time I've been studying China, which is from the late 60s to the present. And in a way, it's all of those ups and downs and changes that make me also believe that it's very difficult to predict the future. So I think a lot of people are, kind of given up on the possibility of inducing any kind of improvement in US-China relations or in inducing moderation of Chinese policy. But I think it's because I've seen such big changes in the past that gives me, I think the future is quite open-ended as well. So, of course, the Mao era was a period of totalitarian China, really, and I started studying China and visiting China during that period. Then, after Mao died, we first led by Deng Xiaoping, who'd been Mao's comrade in arms in the Long March and the Chinese Civil War. Then we did have this whole period in which China had a collective leadership. There was a big improvement in people's lives. The market reform and opening led to a huge takeoff of the Chinese economy. And there are also, even though we often say that China had economic reform but not political reform, but actually there was kind of liberalization in the sense that people could decide what kind of job to have, where to live, and what books to read, whom to marry. And people in China started traveling abroad, studying abroad. And so people's lives definitely improved significantly over that period of time. And relations between China and the United States and other Western countries and its neighbors also were not really that bad. And 8 American presidents, Democrats and Republicans alike, pursued a policy of engagement with China, encouraging the PRC to participate in global institutions, non-proliferation ones, the World Trade Organization. And meanwhile, China was motivated to pursue a policy of restraint and reassurance, trying to give people some confidence that although China had a very different system than the United States, and its economy and its military capabilities were all improving dramatically, that its intentions were benign. And so this reassurance policy worked really quite well. Then in the mid-2000s, and this is a point that I really like to emphasize and is the subject of my book, Overreach, how the end of China's peaceful rise, is that this shift in Chinese policy, both becoming more repressive domestically and more aggressive internationally, starts in the Hu Jintao era. It doesn't start with Xi Jinping. So, you know, we tend to vilify autocratic leaders, but, and things have definitely gotten worse under Xi Jinping, but this starts in the first decade of the 21st century. And why? Why did that happen? A lot of people would say it's just because China became more powerful and economically, technologically, militarily more powerful. And we also had the global financial crisis in which people in China and Chinese leaders grew more confident of their own system because they saw that the global financial crisis was triggered by problems in the American system, and that gave them greater confidence. They became more assertive. But I also think that there were certain features of the way collective leadership worked under Hu Jintao. And I won't take the time to give you the whole book talk about that, but it started then and then has become even more problematic under Xi Jinping because Xi rules as a centralized, personalistic dictator, really, and he doesn't necessarily take the advice of experts or technocrats. He makes a lot of decisions himself. His circle of advisors gets smaller, and he's been carrying out a massive purge of Chinese officials. More than, according to the Central Discipline Commission in China, more than 6 million people have been punished because of disloyalty and corruption since Xi Jinping came into office in 2012. And this puts tremendous pressure on all the subordinates in the system who tend to sometimes over-comply with what they think Xi Jinping wants them to do. So the problems we see in the way China acts domestically and internationally now, I think, do derive a lot from this type of communist authoritarian system that we have in China today. Too long?
No, it's perfect. Admiral.
Just a couple of points to add. If you were a man from Mars looking down at China and the United States, you'd basically ask the Paul Newman question, you know, why can't you guys just get along? Because we do not have the struggle for world ideological supremacy that we had with the Soviet Union, communism versus capitalism and so on. China is very capitalist. We have elements of government control of our economy and all. The territorial disputes we have are just one, Taiwan, which has a tangled history, and the reason it is so central is that China has made it central. The Chinese government has made it central as part of its reason for holding on to power. We will deliver the final victory of the Civil War to you, take back the last piece of our country. So that the rheostat can be turned up and down on that by the Chinese government. And so economically, yes, there's competition, but business people know that you have to have a buyer and a seller on every transaction. So it's ways for people to get ahead, for both two sides to get ahead. So why is it that we are in this very strong rivalry? I mean, I really think you have to go back to Thucydides. That it's sort of, fear, honor, and interests are what big countries, what motivate big countries. And so the two things that are clashing are China's self-image, that it ought to be the big, powerful country in East Asia, certainly, and probably further as it develops, and the United States' 200-year-old policy that we will not tolerate a hostile state dominating the important area of East Asia. We've been, that was true in the Cold War with the Soviets. It was true when we fought Japan in a hot war. It's been true even when we had lesser capability as a country, when we were worried about England being dominant and so on. So it's these two sort of competing visions of how things ought to be ordered in Asia that are at the heart of this competition that manifests itself in all sorts of ways. And leaders on both sides can sort of turn the rheostat up and down on that. But for domestic purposes, you don't get a whole lot of credit for turning the rheostat down, right? For being softer than the other guy. And I think that's true both in the United States and in China. And so this competition in some ways is almost instinctive rather than based on just an absolute clear set of interests. And so it goes back and forth, as Susan said, based on the predilection of the leadership in one country or leadership in another country. And I suppose that's reassuring in a way that we don't have these fundamental, completely insuperable obstacles between us, but it's a little bit worrying in that what if the leadership makes a mistake on both sides, particularly both sides, believing they have to be tough and have to gain advantage over the other side, and that could spin us into trouble.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both Susan and Admiral Blair. Right? I mean, this is a situation of where the U.S. and China have gone kind of hot and cold on their relationship. Often the story we tell ourselves now is that sort of the relationship between the United States and the PRC began in like 1972 with Nixon going to China, but of course 2 decades before that we were fighting a bloody and very costly war against each other on the Korean Peninsula with tens of thousands of Americans dead and hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers dead. And so within the living memories of many of our leaders, we've been in hot wars with the PRC, and we've been in periods where we have had a degree of peaceful relations. The one area I would sort of, I do think increasingly for Beijing, there is an element of ideology that is really weighing in on their motivations. And I think I trace this back, and I think similar to sort of what Susan laid out in terms of this shift, in the aughts and the early 2010s, both a degree of there's a degree of paranoia and also a degree of overly exuberant confidence in which the party increasingly sees as their citizens get greater and greater access into the rest of the world, and that they become wealthier, and then they get these choices like imagine that you get the choice of who you get to marry, or imagine that you get the choice of what your job is. As they gain these freedoms, they find that Chinese citizens are sort of like, well, why can't we have what other people have as well? And you really have a Chinese Communist Party that in many ways, certainly under Hu Jintao, but is really cemented under Xi Jinping as he comes into power, and really identifies his first speech to the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party when he takes power in 2013 is really a speech about how the Communist Party, the Soviet Union, collapsed and failed ideologically, right? That it lost the will to maintain power. And so I think for Chinese leaders, there is a very real ideological struggle that's going on. We don't necessarily see that. Like, we can see that, well, this is really a system that is deeply capitalist, but it's also state controlled, and of course it isn't the same as under Mao. And so we can sort of detect some of these strains within the PRC, but our Chinese counterparts in many ways are quite, they're incredibly confident, but deeply, deeply paranoid that their power is somewhat brittle, and that they could be overthrown internally by their own citizens, or they could have a next generation of leaders who don't identify that the party is strong. And that, I think, is really at the crux of sort of where we're at, is that in many ways, you've got a United States that would prefer to get past great power relations or great power competition. And you have a PRC that understands that as long as sort of the United States exists in the world as it is, which is a power that is sort of out in the world and projecting confidence, that their own citizens will see that as an alternative. It's really what gets us back to the party's real fear about Taiwan. It's not that Taiwanese leaders are going to take back the mainland. It's that Chinese citizens might say to themselves, well, if the Taiwanese people are Chinese and the Taiwanese people are able to have a prosperous, functioning multi-party democracy, why can't Chinese people on the mainland have a prosperous, functioning multi-party democracy? That's what the party fears, and I think that's fundamentally what's at stake here as this is coming apart, is you've got leaders in Beijing who are really uncomfortable with how the world works and they want to recreate the world in a way in which it makes it safe for them, right? It protects them. And that, I think, is what then rubs up against the United States and Japan and various other countries who then see this and really respond in ways to protect themselves. And that's what creates this dilemma.
We've started talking about Chinese leaders' view of the world. And Admiral, you mentioned these conflicting visions of international order between the United States and China. About 3.5 years ago, shortly before the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Xi Jinping and the Russian President Vladimir Putin issued a joint declaration about their views of international cooperation and international order. The text, I think, sheds a great deal of light about how the Chinese are currently thinking about international politics and the problem of international order and the basic principles, the rules of the game of the international system. I'll give you just a couple of examples. This joint declaration declares that the two countries oppose the abuse of democratic values and interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states under the pretext of protecting democracy and human rights. The declaration also insists that the two countries are committed to seeking what they call genuine multipolarity in international affairs, and that they reject all attempts by external forces to undermine security and stability in their neighborhoods. So this declaration, I think, it tells us a lot about Chinese ideas, the Chinese view of the world, but it also raises a whole lot of questions. So could you please offer a few comments? Maybe Admiral, would you be willing to start? What's Xi Jinping's worldview? What are Chinese objectives in foreign policy at the moment?
Sure. I mean, when you read that document, immediately the Declaration of Independence springs to mind. We hold these rights to be self-evident. life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That document says these are tools that should not be used against China. And I think that fundamental difference in values is extremely important, and it will make our relation with China forever transactional until one of us really changes. You just don't trust the other person who believes about such important things in such a different way from the way that you do on a government-to-government basis. Now, many Chinese has had freedom and democracy movements over the years. Tiananmen Square was the most recent one that we all know about. But this fundamental difference of values, I think, also limits the sort of cooperation we can have on specific interests. And I guess the other thing that strikes you about that declaration is that it doesn't have a vision how the world should be ordered, except that Russia and China should have regional spheres of influence in which other countries who are in that sphere of influence listen to them and do what they're told. The United States has sort of worked into a much more of a worldview in which we do things that are good for the United States, sure, but we leave a lot more room for other people being able to prosper as well. And that's been sort of the history since World War II. And I think sensing that, if you look at polls around the world consistently, when they ask the question, which big countries would you rather have in charge? Most of them say, oh, I guess the United States, they're better than most. And they generally leave us alone. They generally keep markets open. They generally don't want to take territory. So we think the way they run the world is about the best you can do, and then we'll do best we can for our own country. So I think those are quite important contrasts, fundamental values, view of how the world ought to operate that are exposed by that document. But words are words, and it's power underneath them that determines if they can be brought into action or not.
Professor Shirk?
Well, I think we have to talk about the color revolutions and the fact that, Georgia and North Africa, and there were a lot of democratic movements which really alarmed Russian and Chinese leaders because they are paranoid. They have no real legitimacy without democratic elections. So the way they were chosen was, somewhat ad hoc. And even though in China they were inching their way toward a slightly more democratic selection process within the Communist Party, not giving people outside the party the right to choose. So the document that you mentioned is really something that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, that's their point of view. I mean, they are very nervous all the time because, as Admiral Blair says, or I can't remember if Matt said it or Denny Blair said it, but the risk of people rising up, the split in the leadership, so they have trouble sleeping at night. And they therefore are fearful of efforts by the United States and other countries to, in their view, to subvert, infiltrate their own political system. And, right now, China's implicit support of Russia is one of the biggest problems that the United States faces, really, because with China, even though they're not directly aiding the war effort, the Russian war effort with military equipment per se, but they are aiding the military-industrial complex within Russia. They're buying a lot of energy from Russia, and they're lending kind of their moral support for Russia. And that is very counterproductive for them, especially in terms of their relations with the Europeans, as well as with the United States. So if they were operating purely on national interest, they would disinvest from Russia. And yet they're not. So that tells you something right there.
Mr. Turpin.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting the way that both Chinese and Russian leaders sort of phrase this. This is somehow the United States interfering inside their own countries or in their neighborhood, because it's very difficult for them to admit that in fact their own citizens might come to conclusions in which they don't want them to be their leaders, right? So, Deng Xiaoping was sort of famous for blaming the United States and the black hand of the CIA for instigating Tiananmen, right? Because for party leaders to admit to themselves that Chinese students and Chinese workers were actually protesting against the party's rule was sort of antithetical, right? Like, of course the Chinese people want us to be their rulers, so it must be that it's a foreign power that's subverting them and making them believe these things. And it's the ideology of the United States, it's the ideas they represent that then become the dangerous thing, right? So not necessarily even US policies, it's simply the expression of it and the existence of it in the world. And that's what sort of makes me feel that this is largely very difficult for us to resolve, because in fact, the outcome that would make Beijing and Moscow sort of comfortable, right? That would make them feel assured that their positions were secure, is a world in which the alternatives don't exist anymore, right? And so for them, it's very totalitarian. I mean, it's very much that they have to get the full outcome, or else they will continue to be deeply, deeply paranoid that some Russian citizen or some Chinese citizen might view the example provided by the United States or a democracy in Japan or a democracy in Taiwan or democracies in Europe as an alternative and actually push for it. That to me is that is the rub that we're up against, and it suggests that it's very difficult for the United States to ever provide Beijing with an assurance that will actually make them feel confident.
But can I jump in here and say that, for many, many years, many people in China, when you ask, well, how do you envision the future of China, would say, oh, well, China will ultimately become democratic, but it's just going to take a long time for us to get there. So the view that we're talking about here is really the view of Xi Jinping and party leaders. It's not necessarily, I mean, we don't know really what is the distribution of viewpoints within the Chinese public about these things. Very difficult to do surveys on them. But, there are many people in China who, and Hu Jintao himself, in his first term, had people working on the gradual evolution of the party into a kind of social democratic party, European style, looking at, so all I'm saying is there are different perspectives within China on all these issues. It's very hard for us to know.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, yeah.
Since President Trump came back to office in January, there's been huge discussion and debate in the United States about the economic relationship between the United States and China. There's been friction over tariffs, friction over rare earths, over semiconductors. What options do you see, what possibilities do you see for addressing these disagreements in trade and economic policy? Do you think the United States should seek to decouple its economy from China? Do you think it should seek to repair the relationship? How do you assess the economic side of the picture?
Yeah, so I mean, I had the opportunity to sort of work on these issues in the first Trump administration. I mean, if you'll remember back to 2017, 2018, 2019, this period of what became known as sort of the first trade war started. I think, first of all, I think it's important to sort of put it into context that it isn't as if the differences over, trade and economic differences between the United States and China began in January of 2017, right? These were long-standing issues, really going back, into the 1990s, but certainly, in the immediate aftermath of China's entry into the WTO. You have China making a number of commitments about the way in which they'll allow the market to play a decisive role. The state will withdraw from controlling the economy. Many of these things were commitments that were made as a sort of a price of entry into the WTO. Really, for any other country other than China, everyone else is required to become a market economy before they join. China was granted the sort of an ability to sort of work its way toward a market economy. And so really during the George W. Bush administration, the Obama administration, much of the negotiation between the United States and China is China, we need you to fulfill the commitments you made to the United States and to the rest of the world that you would run your economy in a way that is compatible with a global trading system. And we did not see that happen, despite sort of rounds of negotiations. I was involved during the Obama administration in many of our strategic and economic dialogues, which would be these sort of large events where officials from the United States and China would meet in either Beijing or in Washington to discuss sort of the economic relationship. And those issues were perennial. We would never get them resolved. And I think what we saw from the first Trump administration was begin to reverse the dynamic. And instead of sort of having negotiations about China, will you please address these problems, it was about placing costs on Chinese behavior first, mostly with tariffs, but also with export controls, restrictions on investments. And then the negotiations turns into, okay, China, you need to change some behavior to lift these costs that we've now imposed on your economy. And in many ways, we're still in that period. But essentially, we've shifted from negotiating about if you don't change, we might impose a cost, to we are negotiating over lifting the cost we've imposed. And I would say that in one of the few things that I think we've watched in terms of a bipartisan consensus is that approach maintained itself during the Biden administration, right? This idea of keeping economic costs on the Chinese economy would stay in place while you negotiated, instead of lifting it before negotiations began. And I think that's an important shift. Now, I think what it means, and this gets to your question about decoupling or de-risking. So I've chosen to adopt another D word, disentanglement, that I think what we're actually watching happen is that when two countries view each other as rivals, the natural tendency is what you want to do is you want the other country to be more vulnerable to you than you are to them, right? And I think from both the United States and China, both countries are seeking to disentangle themselves. They would still like the other country to be somewhat vulnerable to them, right? They would like to be able to have things they're selling. And the U.S. would love to continue to sell agricultural products, right? In many ways, that gives the United States an advantage, right? If we're in a real crisis and China's economy depends upon U.S. agriculture, that might be that might calm nerves and calm tensions in the relationship if the United States has that ability to be able to withhold necessary food, right? That could bring that about. But of course, if you're China, you don't necessarily want to be that exposed. And so you're going to look to make sure that maybe Brazil provides most of the food stuffs that China has. And so I think this dynamic of what some will call decoupling, what some will call de-risking, that I'm going to call disentanglement, I think it is a natural process of this increasingly rivalrous relationship. And both the United States and China are going to pursue it.
Admiral.
I just got back from a couple of weeks in China, and I was talking about some of these issues. I think this economic rivalry between the United States and China will determine a lot of how the future plays out between the two countries. And we do have two fundamentally different approaches. Although there have been recent well-publicized moves in the United States about industrial policy, the United States owning shares in U.S. high-tech companies, the United States getting a portion of the sales of semiconductors to China. Basically, market forces do drive the American economy. You don't develop an industry that you don't have buyers for. Your investors base will just not sustain you having a money-losing company for a long time. China has taken a different view. It believes that it has identified the 10, you can read them, the 10 areas in which future economic dominance will depend. And they list them, and they're the obvious things: semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, electric vehicles, space, right down the list. And they have purposely told their companies that we want you to be the best company in the world in this, and here's a whole bunch of money and tax breaks and free land and subsidies and all, and you go out and become best in class, sell what you can in China, and then sell the rest overseas because your stuff will be cheaper and good enough or better. So two quite different approaches. Just a quick example: 5G was a big controversial business topic here 10 years ago. The next generation of wireless technology. China is much more advanced in 5G deployment right now because the Chinese government simply said, here are the standards, we're going to put out the systems, build it, and they will come. The United States, in putting in 5G, has actually required the telecoms to have the customers have to have telecoms. So now you on your phone, you can play your video games a little faster, you can download your movies a little bit quickly. In some areas that were underserved by Wi-Fi, it's better now, but it's been determined by the telecoms having to make money. That's govern the speed of it. And so the question is, who's right? Can a government be smart enough to pick out the areas of future advantage, pour money into them, and succeed, or will the government succeed that really stays much more out of determining winners and losers, letting the market choose? And I'd say right now the record is mixed. I mean, some sectors are so obvious that of course, country that works on those is going to be powerful. But the other trouble from the Chinese point of view is when they declare an industry to be important, dozens, sometimes hundreds of companies will be formed, get the government handout, the government subsidies for that. Some of it's just squirreled away and lost in corruption. Even that's used to build real businesses, way too many businesses, way too much competition. Prices go down, there are no profits, the companies crash. And this is happening, for example, right now in electric vehicles in China, where I think there are 168 companies that build electric cars in China right now. None of them is making money at this point because the competition has driven the prices down so low. So even if you guess right on the business sector, the industrial sector that's important, you may overdo it, and none of your companies will make money. So first mover, second mover, hare, tortoise, all of these complicated all of these complicated considerations will determine whether this Chinese approach to business will win. And I think that's fundamentally what will determine how things go, not tariffs or these specific sanctions that have the news right now.
Professor Shirk.
Well, I think the technological competition and trade per se and the tariffs are really somewhat separate issues, but they become all mixed up in our policy. And just starting with tariffs, I really feel that it's a tragic situation that the Trump administration began with this complete mistaken notion that bilateral trade deficits actually harm the welfare of Americans, and that we're being ripped off if we have a trade deficit with another country. We should worry about global trade deficits, but bilateral trade deficits really are not that significant for the welfare of our citizens. So a lot of the tariffs that have been imposed, not just on China, but on all, including our friends and allies and really good partners of the United States, are based on the idea that these are somehow reciprocal tariffs, just based on what is the disparity between buying and selling products from, and doesn't even include services with other countries. So, and now we're in this really odd situation where tariffs, because President Trump has been eager to stabilize relations with China, and I applaud his courage in doing that. But as part of doing that, as Matt said, lifting the tariffs that he had previously imposed, now tariffs on China, many of them are lower than tariffs on countries that are much friendlier to the United States, like India, like Brazil, like Switzerland, I believe. And so, that seems to me to be a very bizarre situation that's going to have to get adapted somehow. Maybe it'll involve reducing the tariffs on other countries. Maybe President Trump will realize that the bilateral trade deficits are not really as important as he originally thought they were. On the technology side, that's more about export controls, restrictions on investment. And what's fascinating about what's happening now is that I think we were very confident that our market economy, rule of law, the American system, our great universities, our talent was, superior to anything that an authoritarian country like China could produce. And we thought that a more statist economic system wouldn't work as well. And now we have a few areas, especially AI and this DeepSeek moment, that, and by the way, that's a private company, not a state-owned enterprise, which did not get a lot of subsidies and help from the Chinese government. So not nothing, but it's not a state-owned, what?
The Chinese government didn't even know about DeepSeek until they
So
came out.
anyway, so it's kind of shaken us, and it's led, I think, to a very interesting reconsideration of industrial policy and what does it take for a country to succeed. Even look at biotech. Biotech is really moving very fast in China. Originally, it was just the inputs into pharmaceuticals that came from China and generics, but now it's actual new drug development, and it's being licensed to Western companies. So, I think probably the United States will be looking at this very seriously and thinking that maybe there are ways in which our market economy is not always the best way to go about it.
Well, as three people who have no experience in either business or economics, we
Right.
can have very strong opinions on this,
I don't have an opinion on that.
on this
I'm
topic.
agnostic about that.
Well, let me then turn to a topic that you do have deep experience in, which is military affairs. China has been using its rising prosperity to make significant investments in its military. Starting from a very low base several decades ago, the Chinese government has achieved quite impressive capacities in a variety of areas of military technology, military capabilities. Just earlier this month, the Chinese Navy launched a new aircraft carrier. Could you say a few words, please, about what are the main points of friction in the security realm between the United States and China? And what in your view, should the United States do to avoid a hot war, to prevent a hot war from breaking out between the two countries? Admiral, can I ask you to begin, please?
Yeah, make sure the Chinese know they'd lose it if it broke out. That's the fundamental thing you have to do, and I think that's the case now. It is true that the building rates, the technology, the military parades that China's putting on are very impressive. However, the military task that is at the top of the PLA's list is extremely daunting. That is to take over Taiwan and reintegrate it into China. I mean, think the invasion of Normandy. Think about the huge. Think of the invasion of the main islands of of Japan that the United States planned and mercifully never had to conduct. It's an enormously difficult military maneuver across land or across water, and then fighting your way onto land. And right now, the trends in military technology are making it even harder. Hypersonic weapons, drones, the developments that we've seen. So I think you have to measure military capability compared to the job it would have to accomplish. And by that measure, I just think that China still falls short. And of course, the consequences of losing a military engagement are much greater for authoritarian government like China's than they are for the United States, where you lose your election and the other party comes in and says how stupid their predecessors were. We're going to fix those problems. So I think that Chinese government is inherently conservative because of the dangers of getting it wrong. I think technology is underneath those parade items is making it more difficult for China to do the military task that it sets itself. So I'm much more confident than the articles you read in the paper and the pictures that you see put out generally by Chinese state media these days.
Professor Shirk.
Well, I'd just like to ask you, though, a lot of articles that I read lately by journalists say that China is in the middle of the largest military buildup of any country since World War II. Do you agree with that? Is this really a massive even if it will not succeed, and I'm encouraged by what I learned from you when you talk about how defense in this contingency has an advantage over offense. But do you think that China is in the middle of a military buildup similar to, well, not just World War II, earlier, like Germany? Does it look like Germany to you when you look at it?
I think that I think that there's sort of a Chinese gut feeling, big country, big armed forces. They just think that it's incongruous to them that if they have second largest economy in the world, they're not spending a lot on military forces. When I first visited China back in the last century, I remember talking with the Chinese Minister of Defense, and at that time, the Chinese government had 4 modernizations that they talked about, and military modernization was 4th of 4. And this Chinese general who had actually fought in the Korean War said, you know, we're just we know we're 4th of 4. We can't do much, but if the other 3 modernizations succeed, then we'll get resources, we'll get bigger. And I think that's basically what happened. And so they're getting a lot of resources. An incredible amount is going into corruption. Chinese lost 9 4-star officers in the last couple of months. I mean, they just, you know, there is somewhere, but they don't appear in things, that shady announcements about what they did. And when I asked retired PLA generals 2 weeks ago what was the reason, said it was corruption. These are even people that were nominated by General Secretary Xi to be clean, loyal to him, and within 2 years, the morass of corruption in Chinese arms development sucked them down, and away they went. So I think they're building, and of course numbers do count. Eventually, numbers make a difference, but still relative to the main task they have to do, the numbers that we've seen are inadequate, so the building program is not really going to be something that they can use very soon.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, this military modernization program, you know, really gets underway in the aftermath of the Third Taiwan State Crisis, 1995, 1996. So it's Jiang Zemin who's, you know, that we really need to modernize our military, and primarily we need to be modernizing that military against the United States, right? That's, you know, we're the pacing threat, right? That it's very clear that Chinese military forces, its force posture, you know, its military structure, the weapon systems they adopt, you know, have a very clear understanding of who they would be fighting and what those things are for. And you know, I think in many ways, since it's been going on for nearly 30 years, and you know, a lot of the money that's been spent that have created great and wonderful things for the Chinese military, in some ways have become overcome by events, right? That the U.S. has also changed the way in which it fights and the systems that it deploys. And in many ways, this becomes that, you know, they had a problem in which they were very far behind. So they did very well to catch up with the military of 1999, but they're not necessarily catching up with the U.S. military of what 2025 and 2030 would look like. And so it becomes a very, and they have to have, again, because the scenarios in which they're envisioning the use of that really puts them at a disadvantage in that they're the ones having to launch the attack. They're having to go on the offensive. You know, there are benefits that come in being able to pick the time and place and when it starts, but it also requires a whole bunch of ability to be able to coordinate those things and to do operations that, again, they've never done before, right? None of the individuals that are in any of those positions of command have ever commanded anyone's in combat and doing any of those sorts of things. And so it's very difficult to understand how they'll do it, which gets me thinking that in many ways, this is also a prestige aspect. There's a desire to have a military because big countries have militaries, and they want to use that in a coercive way to get others to back down, and really to use this to avoid fighting with it. Because I think Xi Jinping is equally concerned about the reliability of his own general officers and admirals that he's had to remove, and many of them. And so I'm increasingly more confident that we can maintain a period of deterrence. But I would also put out that authoritarian leaders that are cut off from outside information sources have made terrible decisions in the past, right? Like, all logic would have told you that Vladimir Putin probably should not have launched a war against Ukraine, and that it would unite NATO and not divide it. But he did so anyway, because he was confident. And my fear is that we could find ourselves with a Chinese leader who is deeply confident. He may be mistaken about how the world works, but he's deeply confident, and then we'll roll that dice.
But Susan's, I didn't answer your question very well, Susan. The big force buildups that you've seen historically are to react. Generally, they're to react to either real ambitions or real dangers. That's kind of been, if you look back at them. The Chinese buildup seems to be on the air and naval side a sort of build up everything. It's not like we have this plan. We need to build the exact pieces that will enable us to take Taiwan, and all. It seems, let's build lots of ships, let's build lots of submarines, let's build lots of airplanes, and it's hard to relate that to an actual specific objective that they have. So I think that sort of reinforces Matt's point. There's a big element of big countries have big navies in it, and the aircraft carriers that you mentioned, Mike, I think are a particular example. They just don't make sense from the sense of China's missions. They do make sense for gunboat diplomacy, sending them to distant places to show how powerful China is, that kind of thing. But they don't have a warfighting role in the context of the kind of fights that PLA might get into.
It's now time to open the floor to questions from the audience. If you'd like to pose a question, please raise your hand, and a member of our staff will bring a microphone to you. We have someone at the back, please.
Hi, my name is Deb Aikat, and I'm in the School of Journalism. And just in the spirit of full disclosure, I was born in India, so I follow Chinese politics. India and China had some tensions, but now with Trump imposing tariffs and being a very tough person, India and China have become very good close friends. But that's not what I wanted to ask you about. I would like you to address China's soft power. Let me explain. You remember the Silk Road, which was historic. Now, as you know, China is now recreating that Silk Road initiative, and it aims to help 150 countries. And what it has done, I'll give you one example. In South Asia, Sri Lanka wanted a very modern port. So China said that, hey, we are going to make the port for you. And what was the deal? That you would give us the money. Now, as you know, Sri Lanka had problems. So now in Sri Lanka, there is a port that is entirely owned and operated by the Chinese. We have similar instances in Africa. In Africa, China almost competes with the US and wins because it has invested in mining, it has invested in all the rich resources Africa has, and it also has this soft power. So we have this wonderful situation where China offered to build the headquarters of the African Council, which is a body. And then after some days, this happened almost 6 years ago. So African National Council realized that these walls may be bugged, because they thought that, I don't know if that's true, that there were Chinese devices and they were listening to what they were talking about. And so the African National Council, African Council started meeting somewhere else. So the headquarters was useless. So the reason I mention all of these points is there are nations in Asia and Africa that are tired of this American dominance, and they are trying to develop an alternative linkages. And like Brazil is another nation, and on a good day, Russia shakes its hands with China. So can you address the soft power that China exercises? And sometimes I think it's very successful in many ways. Thank you.
Would you like to begin?
Well, I think that we in the United States underestimate the success of China's initiatives and diplomacy and investments in what we now call the Global South. And although it's true, and actually what you say about starting to meet elsewhere suggests that it's not always a complete success, and especially in countries that have elections, oftentimes the incumbent government is defeated by challengers who criticize the incumbent government for getting too close to the Chinese. And that Chinese investments, if they don't hire local labor, they go to prestige projects for the politicians, you know. So there's some backlash, especially in democratic countries, but in authoritarian countries, of course, we don't see that. So, you know, the Chinese put a lot of effort into this. In Africa, I think it has been pretty successful. And, you know, the United States really has not paid enough attention to Africa and other developing countries. And of course, the way we do investment, it has to be commercially interesting to companies. Americans don't want to spend a lot of money on foreign aid. Our foreign aid is pretty minimal. And, you know, the Chinese are, you know, more successful than we are. And you look at the surveys now, even though I think, Denny, you said something about most people in most countries would rather have America as leader. Yeah. But if you look at the surveys, public opinion toward the United States has grown less positive, and toward China has become more positive.
Yeah, so I wouldn't use the term soft power. I mean, I think, you know, the term that Joe Nye developed around the term soft power is not what Beijing is doing. I mean, Beijing has I think one thing we have to understand is sort of the economic structure of China's relationship with other countries, right? So the US buys very little in terms of raw materials to produce and go into large-scale manufacturing that's turning out products. That's what China's doing, which means that China is the primary customer of what African countries are selling, right? They're the primary customer of what Indonesia is selling, right? So if you're someone who is exporting iron ore, you're not selling it to the United States because the United States isn't buying a lot of iron ore to turn it into other things. China is doing that, right? And so that relationship is a customer relationship, right? So if a country is, you know, that essentially their entire sort of economic future is dependent upon Chinese companies buying the products that they make, lo and behold, that China has a lot of influence in that country. That's not soft power. Chinese investments, the port in Sri Lanka, these are not development aid in which you're providing foreign aid, right? A grant. These are loans, and these are concessional loans. And so that's why the Chinese now own that port, is because Sri Lanka couldn't make a profit off of running it, and in order to repay the loan, they had to turn over the port. And so that's very different. I mean, the United States is not pursuing those kinds of investments. We did in the past. We learned that it was really quite corrupting, and it was fundamentally self-defeating in US interests to be in that business of like buying off leaders. That's the business that Chinese aid is in right now, it's in buying off leaders. And I think that's a dynamic that the United States is going to have to deal with. I think if the US goes through a period of reindustrialization and actually is in the business of buying raw materials again to go into an industrial process in the United States, lo and behold, we may find US companies that suddenly find the reason why they would do business in Africa and other places. But I think that's the dynamic that we're dealing with. And to me, it has much more that's what explains it, rather than this sort of concept that China is just sort of better at this. Because I think objectively they've been really bad, right? I mean, one example that we would lay out is China's experience with the Philippines over the last 10 years. I mean, this is a country that, had China simply held back on some of its territorial acquisitions in the South China Sea, could have likely gotten the Philippines to abrogate its defense treaty with the United States and to never allow the United States to occupy, put military forces in the Philippines. And what did China do? What they did is even with a friendly president in the Philippines, Duterte, they still abused the Philippines by trying to take its territory. When what soft power would have done is, hey, maybe we'll hold off on this a little bit and actually get the outcome in which the Philippines turns on Washington. And they did the exact opposite, and resulted in a presidency that comes back in that reinforces the US-Philippine defense relationship and creates a situation that is far more difficult for China in a neck of its woods where it's really important. And so I think objectively they're not very good at this. And we shouldn't give them credit for these kinds of activities.
The only thing that I would add is the United States and the Soviet Union have a rich history of investing in the global South, and the amount of gratitude that carries over into actual decisions in favor of the United States or the Soviet Union is awfully small. It's sort of, thanks very much. What else can you give me? Oh, and we're taking another direction here, so don't let the door hit you in the back on the way out while we take over the things that you put in here. So I think I agree with Matt that it's in many cases ill executed, but also I think it's fundamentally wrong to think that you can turn largesse into real influence on important issues in countries.
Here in the front row.
Hi, I've been in and out of China every year since '89 with some national projects I had there. But the question isn't that. China's technological superiority in some areas is amazing. Why will the US at some point consider inviting some of them to come into our country in the same way that, say, for example, Tesla went to China? China took its model, its technology, everything, and has, gone way beyond Tesla. And so can you see a time when we will be open to bringing Chinese companies into the US to share that technology in some way? Obviously, we don't have a model like China that says you come here, we get your technology. So it's a big question for the future.
I mean, I would personally welcome it in a number of sectors. Making a battery technology. I think I would insist upon a degree of reciprocity, right? That for the last 30 years, China's response to that sort of movement of technology, capital, and know-how into China has been that U.S. companies have to enter into a joint venture in which your joint venture partner owns about 51% of that. The intellectual property needs to be transferred into that joint venture, and the foreign company needs to train, domestic workers to be able to make the stuff. I think that's a great deal. I actually would quite welcome that those are the terms of the agreement. I think Beijing would understand exactly what that means, and I think reciprocity is a great way to think about this. There isn't necessarily that it's anything that is fundamentally dangerous about learning how to make a good battery. But I would, if China wants to invest and sell in the United States, I think they should build facilities here, and I think they should transfer the technology and train American workers on how to make it. I think it's a spectacular idea.
So I'm a big fan of this idea too, and we have a little study project now on this, what it would take to make this feasible on the security side, political side. But, a lot of people say, oh, no, this could never happen because the backlash against China at the local level. And we have seen that, of course. In Michigan, we saw it with the battery factory and things like that. But local leaders used to be the most enthusiastic about Chinese and all foreign investment in their local communities. Of course, you won't get the same job creation now that robots are so much more important than they used to be. But still, any new manufacturing facility or even a joint venture with an existing one is going to have a stimulus effect on the local economy. It'll be good for people in that community. And I think if President Trump has expressed already a positive view of this, and I think that public opinion can turn around on this, I think, pretty quickly. Now, there may be some sectors or some types of manufacturing that it will be really hard to handle the security side, the data issues and things like that. But I think if we put our minds to it, we can probably figure out in a lot of areas to do this. And I think it will have a lot of positive spillovers on U.S.-China relations more generally, too, because on the people-to-people side, I'm trying to think, like, what should the BYD Little League team, what should it be called? So...
Well, in the same spirit that the Chinese have done it, obviously the name of it inside the United States wouldn't be BYD.
No, but...
And the intellectual property would transfer with it, so it would be an American company.
Right,
it just would be capitalized by the Chinese.
But
Right,
but the question is, would we work out a policy like China so we could require Chinese companies to share?
Well, that's the question. That is the so.
It's
I think
good
the actual
we're
question
talking
is
about it now, though.
Beijing would be unwilling to share that technology because they know exactly what this looks like, because it's exactly what they've done to our companies. And so I think it's unlikely that Beijing would agree to the terms that I laid out, in which the intellectual property transfers to the joint venture, and the joint venture is controlled by Americans in the U.S. with workers that are trained to do it.
But licensing, you can do a lot with licensing.
Well, that's not a transfer of intellectual property. So the intellectual property maintains.
But we licensed a lot of things to Chinese companies. We didn't.
And they took that technology and IP and then commercialized it themselves.
Not necessarily. Qualcomm technology is not commercialized in China, and it was licensed. So, I think there are ways of doing this.
I think that, part of it requires a little bit of restraint on the Chinese government side because I gotta tell you, Chinese businesses would be happy to operate. You talk to some Chinese businesses, and it's as if you're talking to any international business. They're sharp. They know they have a good product. They want to conform to other things. But then there's this this guy sitting in the back of the room who is the government representative who has the power to force that company to do anything that the Chinese government, that means the Ministry of State Security, the PLA, to take advantage of whatever position it has in the United States or in trade to do things that are in the short near-term advantage of China. I mean, I tell the Chinese friends that I deal with, they're just stop this stupid spying. I mean, I was a director of national intelligence. I know the value of intelligence. You don't need all of it. And if you would just stop these certain stupid spy rings that you are putting out there, give Americans a little bit of an idea that what they see is what they get if they have a Chinese contact or company or student or whatever, then a lot of things would be possible. But there are enough instances of Chinese misuse of legitimate business, people-to-people, other relationships that you think, whoa, wait a minute, we're just being taken advantage of here. It's a one-way street. So I think that to get this at a large scale, I have talked to the Chinese American Chamber of Commerce, by the way. There is an association of Chinese companies that are doing business in the United States, so it can be done. But if the Chinese government would back off a little bit on this just pushing to the last degree to take advantage of any relationship for narrow security purposes, it really help.
We're running a little short on
we're
time.
going to do 3 questions in a row, and then the panel can decide what they're going to comment on. All right.
Hi, good evening. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. I'll make it quick because I know our time is short. In 1972, Nixon and Kissinger went to open up China. My question is, to what extent did that event impact the discussion we've had tonight? I mean, said another way, was the Nixon-Kissinger initiative an opening of a Pandora's box or a gateway to the future?
Okay. I was excited when y'all talked about sort of how the initiative, Russia's initiative in Ukraine, sort of reflects how like a change in like the perspective and how warfare is commenced nowadays in terms of like the mass drone use and the development of hypersonic missiles has sort of changed the dynamic between the U.S. and China. In a similar vein, I kind of wanted to ask about how you think the sort of shift in the economies have like advantaged one side or the other, and when it comes to the like now widespread investment in AI and data centers and like the chips and stuff like that. And I just wanted to sort of ask like if that, how you think that has changed the relation, and if you think that has advantaged one side over the other.
Hi there, thank you for being here tonight. We talked a little bit about kind of China's worldview on our economic rivalry between them, their military goals, and especially our sort of transactional relationship. And my question was, in all of your opinions, what would be the most productive attitude for our United States government to have toward China, both economically, politically, but most importantly, militarily?
So her question was, what would be the most productive attitude the U.S. could have towards China?
Would you like to begin?
I'll take that one. I think we need to be more explicit about what are American objectives vis-a-vis China. I'm not a big fan of the idea of primacy per se. And I think there are Chinese policies and Chinese actions that are unfair and detrimental to US interests, and we should focus on those. And then we should use diplomacy plus carrots and sticks to try to achieve those objectives. So I think that would be, and I'm a little bit hopeful about the fact that over the next year, we're going to have an exchange of presidential visits, which gives the professionals in both governments times to identify their priorities and to see if they can't negotiate some outcomes which both sides would be able to declare wins to their public and show that their approach toward one another is working well. So, but one problem right now, I can tell you, is on the US side, we don't have those professionals we need to do that negotiation. I really wish Matt Turpin were back in government. And, I went into the NSC last week. NSC Asia looked like a ghost town. There's hardly anybody there. It's been cleaned out. So that's something we really need to restore if the professionals are going to be able to use this period of diplomacy to achieve our objectives.
Yeah, I'll answer the question I remembered, which is the role of the Kissinger-Nixon opening in '72, and I'd say it was basically a step along the way to break out of this this glacial immobility that had settled on U.S.-China relations since the Korean War, and all through the 60s with Vietnam, in which China backed North Vietnam, and we were backing South Vietnam and fighting ourselves. So I think it was a good first step. The reason I don't give a whole lot of prescience and brilliance to President Nixon and National Security Advisor Kissinger is that if you read all those declarations in '72, the economic aspects of them are almost non-existent. Almost non-existent. This idea that the United States was going to go to China for business purposes, it was not part of their vision at all. It was largely President Nixon's idea that China's too big to be left out and not talked to and not involved in the international system one way. And if it became a part of the international system, it would be a pretty good offset to the Soviet Union. That was what motivated it. But that sort of broke the logjam. And so that as things went on during the 70s and the Carter administration finally established formal diplomatic relations, and then the Reagan administration readjusted it with the Taiwan Relations Act, it was sort of a sequence that led it to now when, we are, despite all of these tenets we've talked about, China knows the United States a lot better than the Soviet Union did. We know China a lot better than we knew the Soviet Union. There are people talking. So it's there are problems to be worked out, but at least they're not this unknowing antagonism which really characterized what we did for during the Cold War.
Yeah, I'll touch on that one. I largely agree. I don't consider it a Pandora's box. I also tend to give. I think we maybe try and hold policymakers and political leaders to really an unfair standard. I mean, certainly in 1972, no one thought that China was an economic opportunity. I mean, this is a decade plus out of the Great Leap Forward. This is in some of the worst aspects of the Cultural Revolution. The country is an economic basket case. And obviously from Nixon's perspective, this is about how do I gain a geopolitical advantage against the Soviet Union, right? And if I can pull China and the Soviet Union, that already obviously split, but if I can pull them closer into the US orbit, and I can really create a situation in which the Soviet Union is truly isolated and contained, that is super beneficial for the United States. And so there's a logic to why the US would pursue that relationship. And it's within a Cold War construct. And then when the Cold War ends, I think in many ways, Susan is at the beginning of this as the United States has to reinvent, like, what is our relationship with China? Because if the Cold War ends and the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, like, what is it that we're going to do? And I think at that point in time, it made an awful lot of sense to pursue a policy of engagement. If you could persuade the Chinese to essentially move towards and become a part of a global system that is generally liberal and accept the kinds of economic reforms, then that's a plus, right? And I don't think there's any way we could hold Nixon or Kissinger responsible for being able to see how that all unfolds. In terms of the economic developments and technology, this is not new that technological developments are going to change the distribution of power. I think in AI, certainly we should have some deep concern about the success that the Chinese have had with DeepSeek and a couple of other models. But really, I think that the policies adopted by the Biden administration around export controls on advanced semiconductors really remains a centerpiece of sort of a U.S. approach. That success in artificial intelligence really depends upon four things: your access to data. The United States and China have access to data. Like, there is no relative advantage between the two. Access to talent. Talent is generally evenly split between the United States and China in terms of making artificial intelligence models. Algorithms. Algorithms are mathematical formulas, really hard to keep them secret. Once you have a breakthrough in one, particularly if it's open sourced, it's going to be spread. There's no natural advantage you gain from that. Really, it's the fourth area. It's around the hardware. It's around the chips. And China is still deeply, deeply, deeply behind on making advanced GPUs. And as long as that remains the case, the United States has a significant advantage in being able to field these things. And I think that's an advantage the United States needs to continue to press forward. And that likely will have impacts on our economy. It'll likely have impacts on our military capability. And we should continue to pursue that.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. But before we conclude, I just want to remind members of the audience that a recording of this event will be available on the PPD YouTube channel in the coming days. And I'd like to invite all of you to join us for a slice of pizza in the lobby after we wrap up. But for now, thank you for a wonderful discussion, and I would ask you to join me in a round of applause for our panelists.